me, and thanks to Carlin and Jane and Lisa for arranging this.
Okay.
And it's really, I feel excited to be here. My slide will be more exciting. Okay, we're gonna watch on this side. So, yes. Awesome. So just over 61 years ago, November 14th, 1963, there were there was one fishing boat off the south coast of Iceland. It was early in the morning, November, so it was dark, and the cook was on the deck, and he smelled sulfur. So we looked up the engineer to see if there was something wrong with the engine. The engineer checked it out, the boat was fine, but they soon noticed they were in something like a whirlpool. And then an eruption column occurred just off the back of the boat. This is about 20-30 miles off the coast of Iceland. So it was spewing tephra about 100 meters in the air. This is on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So it's this eruption occurred about 100 years. Within a couple of days, that eruption column was going several kilometers into the sky. And now the land was starting to grow at about 25 meters a second, or approximately a great pyramid every day was coming up and growing on the sky. Initially, some of researchers went out there, but as you can see there, it was still quite active. So they landed on the island and said there were lava boulders in the air.
So the key was not to run away from the lava boulders, but stand up, eat them until you saw them coming, and then you ran away. But even those early days, there was some thought maybe they would turn that island over to tourism. There was a pushback among volcanologists and biologists. Okay, I hear myself over there. Volcanologists and biologists that maybe they could actually take advantage of this brand new island and use it as a living laboratory. So this was Surtsey Island. It's named after the Nordic god Surtur, the god of fire. And I was lucky enough to go there in 2021. So that's what Surtsey looks like almost 60 years after it emerged. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not because it's only because it's one of the youngest islands on Earth, which is true, but also because it's been maintained as a living laboratory. 6 biologists and 6 geologists go to the island every year for a week at a time, and that's it. And I was lucky enough to be one of them in 2021. Almost didn't make it there. If any of you have been in Iceland, the weather can be horrific. So we kept getting fogged out, and they are very strict. If you don't make it to the island, then it's over for the year. But luckily, the Icelandic Coast Guard got us there, and I got to see, really, I think, one of the great places to explore how animals can influence ecosystems. Even the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission in the 1970s recognized the value of this. They started funding early researchers because they wanted to know what life might be like after an atomic blast. And in a sense, this was as close as they were likely to get. These are the first 2 birds that were raised on the island, black guillemots. Erling Olafsson is the researcher that got me onto the island. It's fun to be on an island where many of the people are older than the land you're walking on. And in fact, even some of the birds are older than Surtsey itself. So, and it's had incredible retention. People know how lucky they are there. So many of the researchers do spend their entire careers. They do other things, of course, too. They might be ornithologists or botanists, but every year they're revisiting this island. The guillemots were giving them a hint. They had no idea how life was going to get back there, except by observing the plants that floated in. So volcanic areas are typically rich in phosphorus, but they have low levels of nitrogen. So the only plants that survived for the first really decade there were ones that floated in, like sea rocket or oyster leaf. They had large seeds, that were they could bring their own nutrients in there, right? It was like a suitcase of nutrients. So they survived along the edges there. And there's still much of Surtsey looks like that. It's really just a few species that can colonize the edges of the island. What started to change is when greater blackback gulls and lesser blackback gulls and herring gulls started to breed in that area in the 1970s and early 1980s. A bird can release about 100 grams of technical term poop into those areas. And on Surtsey, in their breeding areas, they deposit about 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And that's comparable to a farmer who would be managing a pasture or managed land. So a significant amount of nitrogen. So this is what it looked like without the birds. And this is what the breeding areas look like today. They changed dramatically. Almost all of the diversity, the plant diversity, is in these breeding areas, and there's 50 times the biomass in the areas where the birds are compared to where they're not. And that has expanded over time. It's dynamic. The birds aren't only bringing in nutrients, but they're also bringing in the seeds. So it's estimated about 2/3 of the plants on that island came either on the feathers or on the legs of the birds themselves. So they're actively building this ecosystem. For me, wanting to write a book at how animals can influence ecosystems, this seemed like the perfect place to start. As any ecologist knows, when you're looking at systems, they're complex. It's really hard to detect where things started and how any individual animal or plant is having an impact. Here they knew almost every plant by name, as well as the birds. I mean, they really observed every individual that was coming in across this time. And you can see here a timeline of the species that arrived. The first ones, sea rocket, sea sandwort, those are the ones with those large seeds. A few species, fulmars and kittiwakes, come in, but it's really the 1980s when the gulls come in that you have meadow grasses. You have basically grasslands are forming in that area. And then along with the plants came the insects. So the insects, now you have insects there and insectivorous birds like snow buntings are there. So a whole community developed in just 60 years. You see this whole islands start to change, and now puffins are starting to come in. They're probably the future of the island. If you see the island, the cool thing about being in a place like Surtsey is that you see the geological forces, the abiotic and the biotic forces, and they're at work in real time. Seals have also come in. That one I just cut and pasted on that there. I think people thought like, wow, that seal got way up high there. They pop on that northern spit there, and you can see the green there. They also bring in not as much as the seabirds, but a substantial amount of nutrients, either through their feces, but also through placentas. So they're having an impact on one of the part of the island as well. And you can see this from space. At the bottom there, that's the breeding area at the bottom of the island. At the top of the island, it's a little hard to see here. There's a green stretch. But the plant cover tells that story quite clearly. The gull colonies have a high amount of cover. And without these animals, Surtsey would likely be like that green line at the bottom there. Very low cover and things changing very slowly. Animals can make this dynamic and bring these nutrients in a relatively short time. So here in this image, you can see both the geological forces as well as those biotic forces occurring. The shift at the bottom, that's from the currents, that's from erosion. The island has changed shape. And then on the upper right, you see the changes either from the seals or from the gulls. So these gulls are moving nutrients tens, maybe hundreds of kilometers, but animals are moving across the world all the time. And Chris Dowdy, who worked here, is the one that gave me the metaphor of thinking of animals like the artery or the circulatory system of the planet. We think of plants as the lungs. It's the animals that are moving nutrients across vast distances. We're seeing here that summertime These are tags from the Max Planck Institute, tagged animals. And now winter's coming in, and you can see in that northern hemisphere, this winter in the northern hemisphere, species moving back towards the equator. That really sort of, that image tells a lot about the way that animals can move these nutrients across the planet, across vast distances. But the largest migration on the planet among animals is happening every day. And it's trillions of organisms that are moving up and down in the oceans and also in freshwater systems. That movement, so this diel vertical migration, they're typically feeding at the surface at night, and then during the day, they sink into depth where it's dark, presumably to hide from predation. So these animals are moving back and forth at that time, and they're moving nitrogen, they're moving carbon. The basic system is this biological pump, where about 10 gigatons of carbon per year is being exported from the surface to the deep sea, either through feces or through death. And I learned about this in marine ecology when I was working on whales in the 1990s at the University of Florida. And as I was sitting in the back of the room, and I'm like, well, there's something missing here. There's one group of animals that actually does the opposite thing. They're bringing nutrients up. And a few years after that class, I found my notes from when I learned about the biological pump. And you can see there, it's right whales. The first right whale I ever saw, that's the species, North Atlantic right whale. It's the species I've studied for much of my career. A male came up in the front of the boat, had mud on its head because it had been diving to the bottom of the Bay of Fundy, maybe 100, 200 meters down. And it's breathing, resting, and then just before it fluked, it put out an enormous fecal plume. And it's sort of that just stuck, one of the first whales I've ever seen. And the first time I saw this defecation, and when I was in this class, I'm like, well, maybe this could be ecologically important. And I mentioned it to one of my colleagues who is a biological oceanographer, and he said, yeah, maybe it's important, or maybe it's just a fart in a hurricane. So that's what really set us. I finally found a colleague, Jim McCarthy, who is willing to entertain this. So the drawing is right whales dive. They release feces, nitrogen at the surface, picked up by phytoplankton, and then consumed by copepods, which are their prey. Unfortunately, there are only about 350 to 400 right whales on the planet. So even at that point, I'm like, well, what about when there were 10,000, when they were abundant? At this point, their ecological function, though we've studied, isn't going to be as big. But historically, for a lot of whale species, we're thinking about changes over time. So Jim McCarthy, and he spent his career looking at nitrogen in the oceans. He was willing to help me analyze this and to get an idea whether the whale pump was ecologically relevant. How much nitrogen do whales, and we also looked at seals and seabirds as well, how much nitrogen are they moving in the Gulf of Maine, the area that we were studying at that time? So this is the Gulf of Maine, that's Boston on the left there, and Nova Scotia up on the right. And our initial estimates were whales were bringing more nitrogen into the Gulf than all of the rivers combined, and comparable to coastal point source, which is humans. Of course, we play a role here, but humans are putting these nutrients out very close to the shore, whereas whales are bringing them to the productive areas in that area. So about 24,000 metric tons. So, all right, first hint that actually this could be quite important. And I'll talk about why it matters seasonally in a moment. It was rejected, this paper, when we initially submitted it. In part, one of the reviewers said, well, you guys are right there on the water and you built this model, but why haven't you analyzed the fecal samples itself? Which is the last thing you really want to hear as a scientist, like start again. But we acknowledged that's probably true. And I had colleagues that were out on the water that year. So we started collecting fecal samples from humpback whales and right whales. Popular Science caught on to this and called it one of the worst jobs in science. The worst one is hazmat diver, which, like diving in human sewage, probably worse. But it is true that, well, at least for right whales, the feces can smell really strong, and if you get it on your clothes, you're basically gonna have to throw it. It doesn't matter how much you wash them, you have to throw them away. Humpback whales, much more subtle, and like smells just only slightly briny. And in fact, the diversity, I think of every, like, I come from Vermont, where a local meteorologist was the one that framed the term "every snowflake is unique." I think of every fecal plume as unique in color, in shape, in where it floats, and it really is about diet and individuals. But we've analyzed those samples now. We went out there on that first time and we had that idea to look at nitrogen, but since then, phosphorus, iron, particulate organic nitrogen concentrations, nitrogen stable ratio, isotope ratios, as well as changes in ammonium over time. And then we've had graduate students come out and start to look at the gut microbiome. And my colleagues who had originally started this work looking at glucocorticoids, so looking at stress levels in whales. So enormous amount of information that's coming from this, in addition to examining this question about how much nitrogen are they moving. Problem is, it can be hard to find these samples, even though sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you could maybe 1 or 2 a day following whales all day. So how could we optimize that? A colleague of mine, Roz Rolland, had an idea of how we might be able to increase the number of samples we collect each day, and that is using sniffer dogs. So this is Fargo, a 90-pound Rottweiler who was originally a companion for an elderly woman. And when she went into assisted living, he started working as a sniffer dog in the prison system of Washington State, looking for drugs, and then got what I think for many dogs would be a dream job. He became wildlife detecting dog, right? Looking for grizzly bear scats, looking for mountain lion scats, and a bunch of other things. And my friend Roz Rolland had the crazy idea, if it works on land, maybe it'll work on the water as well. Advantage ocean is no hills, no trees, so the scent is coming straight. Disadvantage, of course, dogs can't run on water, so it's really the boat handler has to know how to do that. And it's also, when you're just looking in the water, it's hard to know where you were. It can be really disorienting when you're looking for a small sample in that area. Unfortunately for Fargo, he got seasick, so he took Dramamine before every trip. And his colleague Bob was terrified of whales, so he would curl up at the bottom of the boat. He only lasted 1 season, but he retired to Vermont, so he got lucky. But these dogs were incredibly effective in that they could find a couple of 2.5 times more samples per day than humans could alone. So maybe every couple of hours instead of getting 1 sample a day. That's about that black box on the upper right there is when Fargo hits a scent, and it's basically his tail is wagging. He's very excited. And then when you see that X outside of that scent cone, now he's settled down. He's not on the scent anymore. So you have to have a handler and a driver that are responding to this dog. And then the circle here is about 100 meters away. That's when we can start to smell it. Humans smell it at 100 meters away. For Fargo, is a nautical mile. So you could find it at a great distance and really enhanced our ability to collect a lot more samples in that area. And fortunately, because I probably wouldn't have built up that story if we didn't have a good answer, we found high levels of ammonium, which is one of the most bioavailable forms of nitrogen in the ocean, in the feces, and it was released over time. So high levels of ammonium that was released into the water over time, as well as indications that phytoplankton were picking up this nitrogen. So this was one of our initial studies on examining how the nitrogen gets into this system, and also whether it's picked up by phytoplankton over time. This is most important seasonally. So you might have heard of a spring bloom in the oceans. There's a lot of mixing in the winter. The nutrients are well mixed throughout the water column. In the spring, a thermocline, a gradient in temperature forms in the ocean, and that's what causes the bloom because the phytoplankton is up towards the surface, lots of nutrients, and you have high productivity. That declines over the summer. With that thermocline, the phytoplankton uses up those nutrients. So that's when you have less productivity in the area, but that's when the whales are there. So the whales are most abundant on the right there in the summer. That's when that nitrogen flux matters. In the winter, when they're not there, and really that the limit isn't going to be nitrogen. It's the summer when it's limited, and it's the summertime when the whales are most active, that they're moving these nutrients across that thermocline. And they're also actually, by moving back and forth, helping to break down that thermocline a bit as well. So a form of mixing, like a biotic mixing for these animals. Since then, there have been studies around the world looking at different cetacean communities and what they call nutrient cocktails. So in the system where I worked, it tended to be nitrogen limited. Other systems are phosphorus limited. A lot of the southern hemisphere is iron limited, and other micronutrients can be limited as well. You find all of these nutrients in whale feces, and it depends on the cocktail depends on the species and where the animals are found, what they're feeding on, and then where it matters most in the area where you might have these limiting nutrients that they're delivering. Chris Dowdy, who worked here, I chatted with him back, I don't know, and the Advinder was on this paper too. We talked about, could we look at movement of nutrients, not only by whales, but for other megafauna as well. So whales are, in this case, we were looking at phosphorus, not nitrogen, are moving these nutrients up and down in the water column. Seabirds and anadromous fish like salmon are moving them onto the land, and then terrestrial herbivores are dispersing that. So you can see this animal-mediated movement of phosphorus, again, like that system, that circulatory system that we were talking about before. So we don't use dogs anymore. It's not quite as fun, but we do have new technologies to understand whales, and especially to understand what whales are doing beneath the surface of the ocean. When I started out in the field, almost everything we knew about whales was at the surface, what we could observe. Probably the most boring part of a whale's life is we're watching it almost when they're sleeping. Now we're using drones and suction cup tags to understand what whales are doing beneath the surface. This is a fin whale, Gulf of California. Drop that tag on the back. The whale doesn't even react, you see? And that's a suction cup tag that can measure everything from temperature to sound, and you can also put critograms on these as well. So now we're getting an idea of what it is like to be a whale. So I'll show you a video that was put on the back of a humpback calf in Hawaii. I think that's the, yep. Actually, some sound. A friend of mine wrote some music for this. So this is the humpback calf, maybe a couple of months old, is on the lower right there, and the camera's set on its back. And these are mackerel scad, and mom is peeing there. And for me, that made my year probably when I actually observed whales peeing, because again, this is very hard to collect. These are mackerel scad that are feeding on the sloughing skin. The whales are constantly sloughing their skin, and also on leaked milk. So you can see that cloudy area there. The calf is suckling here. And that's mom's pectoral fin up top there. So these are two other pathways, which is animals that are feeding either on the skin of the whales or on the milk. The scad aren't migrating. And that's the grooves of the mom there. He's under the mom. Well, it is. I don't know what the sex of that calf is. And calves can't hold their breath for that long. like the moms can. So now it's coming up for breath of air, and it's just a nice picture. So I'll let this run. Calves coming up. And that's Maui in the background. Mhm. And there's mom again at the bottom there. And that's the research boat at the top there in the distance. So this really, like the first time I started seeing this, it really blew my mind. And we've been working on, besides just being beautiful, working on what this means. So what kind of nutrient transport are these whales doing across the planet? So we were talking about this vertical movement, but whales have the longest migration of any mammal. They can travel thousands of kilometers each year, and they're capital breeders. What does that mean? It means they're feed for what part of part of the year, and then they breed in another part. So whales fatten up that blubber layer. They're feeding 2 to 3% of their body weight per day in the summer, and then migrating to lower latitudes. Here's Alaska to Hawaii to breed. And that's where that image comes from there. So what kind of nutrients could they move from these high to low latitudes? One are placentas and carcasses. So they're like many mammals, there's high infant mortality among whales. Whales tend to live a long time, but that first year can be a tough time for individuals. Most of the, by measurements, most of the nitrogen is coming through the urine, but also there's skin sloughing as well. That's a tiger shark on the right feeding on a calf. We don't think that the sharks predate on it, but they certainly scavenge on it. Interestingly enough, nursery areas for some shark species overlap with the calf, with breeding areas for whales. So it might be a source of food for lots of different animals. So we think of this movement. In blue is the summer foraging area, and the lighter areas are the breeding areas. In a way, I don't know if it's not that easy to see it, but they're kind of funneling these nutrients. Whales will feed in several different places across the summertime, but they really go to one particular area, very defined area, in order to breed. Right. And there's, for 1 year, females getting pregnant, the next year having its calf, and then the next year is a rest. So, but they're always coming back there each year. For these maps that we use 19th century whaling data, as well as contemporary databases that were openly available online. So just to get an idea, here's Hawaii again. That's a heat map. The red is where most of the whales are breeding. But humpbacks bring, just this one species, bring as much nitrogen through urea as the physical processes in that system. So physical processes like wind or upwelling areas, that whales are bringing in more nitrogen into that system than those physical processes combined, and presently comparable to what seabirds are bringing into these areas. Historically, when whales were more abundant, they would have had a much larger role. Difference is that the whales are bringing it thousands of kilometers and the seabirds are bringing it 10 or 100 kilometers each day. Whale carcasses can happen in those shallow waters, but really some of the most fascinating research has come out since the 1990s on what are called whale fall communities. So if whales die over the deep sea, entire communities that show levels of succession are found on these carcasses. And the larger whales have more diversity and can persist a lot longer than the smaller whales. More than 100 species have been found only on whale falls alone, and then another couple of hundred species that are found also in hydrothermal vents or other deep sea systems. That's Osedax up top, the bone-eating worm. It actually doesn't have a mouth, doesn't have a gut, it doesn't have an anus. It is absorbing nutrients through that root system. It's a polychaete worm, and there are chemosymbiotic bacteria that are taking in some of these nutrients and providing the essential food for these worms. I did a modeling project with Craig Smith, one of the early pioneers in this work, a couple of years ago. And we looked at what the impact was on whaling on these deep sea ecosystems. Think about something like blue whales in the southern hemisphere or right whales. They're at like 1% of what numbers they were historically. Largest animals ever to have existed on the planet. Think about if you take out that much biomass and that many individuals, what kind of impact it would have. And we think possibly some of the earliest marine extinctions actually happened in these. We didn't have many large whale extinctions, but when you take out these large habitats and the larger the whale, the more these communities will, the longer these communities will persist. So that's why it's sensitive to size, and that when you have a small habitat, you're not going to have the persistence over that long time. So these are the 4 ecological pathways we've been working on for the past 10, 20 years. Whales as predators has been studied forever. I mean, that's what whaling, much of the research before, I would say 2010, was really, what do whales eat? When do they eat it? How do they eat it? It's been only in the past 20 years, 30 years at most, that we've been thinking about the role of carcasses, nutrient transfer, and then also, and this has been fascinating to watch change, the role of whales as prey. And as baleen whale populations like humpbacks have come back, we're seeing more attacks, especially from orcas, and it's changed the behavior of the whales. And historically, orcas almost certainly relied on, especially young calves. They probably couldn't attack adults, but we're seeing behavioral changes among the baleen whales now. When whales die, they can also strand. So those nutrients can be brought to the deep sea when they die, but also onto land. There's a paper out on polar bears, that polar bears during interglacial times may have depended on whale carcasses. They didn't kill the whales, but they fed as scavengers along on the water's edge. And at that point, again, there would have been 10 times more bowheads in that area. It's not only polar bears, it also has affected California condors, which historically had fed on marine mammals almost exclusively. When those populations declined, California condors populations crashed. They also started feeding on terrestrial mammals. And animals, and that's a problem because they would feed on hunted animals that had been hunted with lead bullets, so they had very high level of lead poisoning. So this shift had real consequences for lots of species. This is something I would say we're just starting to understand very early on. When whales strand, of course, for scientists, it can also be valuable. On January 29th in 2019, this 37-foot male whale stranded in the Everglades National Park. So that's in the Gulf of Mexico. There are very few baleen whales in that area. So scientists examined the DNA of this species, did a necropsy, and found it was an adult male with no external signs of trauma. So it hadn't been hit by a ship or it hadn't been caught in gear. But the DNA matched this really small population of non-migratory baleen whales that were later described as a new species only in 2019. So a new species of whale described only 5 years ago. Unfortunately, one of the rarest on Earth. There were only about 50 individuals, maybe even fewer. Unfortunately, the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of Mexico is one of the most industrialized in the world. Lots of oil extraction. It's estimated that probably 25% of the Gulf of Mexico whales died after the Deepwater Horizon spill, and they're impacted by all sorts of human activities. So this has been an active area of conservation efforts for me and a lot of my colleagues. And they actually ID'd that individual as they had seen that individual alive the previous year, so they could match it to an individual whale that had been spotted before. Sadly and disturbingly, the cause of death was hemorrhaging and acute gastric necrosis. It had swallowed a piece of plastic, probably from a 5-gallon, the buckets that are used along the coast. and only like the size of a credit card. So a small piece of plastic killed this whale. It's hard enough to be fighting against the ocean noise and others, but when we think about that small pieces of plastic like that could kill whales, you see the kind of what we're up against in trying to help restore this whale. And that brings me to the reality check that, of course, I've been talking about wild animals, but the truth is of only about 4% of the biomass of all mammals is wild. It's mostly us and domestic animals. So one reason I think that we don't think of as animals often as being major players in ecosystems is because, well, the mammals aren't really in the contemporary world when 90%, 96% of the biomass is dominated by these animals. Similar patterns, not as extreme for birds. It's kind of like a pattern described by Daniel Pauly, who's a fisheries scientist. He has this term shifting baseline. The idea is that you set the baseline of what is natural to either your childhood or when early in your career. And that would have been different for your parents or your grandparents or generations ago. We're often seeing that baseline essentially in fishes declining over time. But we don't necessarily, we don't see it over the long term. Good news is we can and we have turned this around. I've been talking a lot about poop and a lot about death. I'll end with some eating. Northern sea otters, they eat about 25% of their body weight per day. They're about the size of my Labrador Retriever. So think if your dog were eating 20, and my dog would love to do that if I let it, I'm sure. If they were eating that much. So because they live in these cold waters, they don't have a blubber layer. They're just using fur. That's what endangered these animals, is their fur was incredibly valuable. Populations declined again by well over 90% between the time they were first hunted in the 1700s, at least economically, to the 1960s and 1970s. The population, almost all of them, were restricted to the Aleutian Islands in that red circle there. The main island where they were found was called Amchitka, and the US had been conducting nuclear tests. I told you we're going to come back to the Atomic Energy Commission. Atomic Energy Commission had been conducting nuclear tests, and the bombs kept getting bigger and bigger. It was no longer feasible to use them in the deserts on the continent, so they were looking at offshore areas. Amchitka was the place they decided to do the largest underground nuclear explosion they had ever conducted. Unfortunately, that was the home of thousands of sea otters. Greenpeace was just starting at that time. Really, that same year, Greenpeace, in a sense, was reacting to these nuclear tests. And some biologists in Alaska, this is before Alaska had oil, so it was still a relatively poor, isolated state. They suggested to the Atomic Energy Commission, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have these bloody corpses wash up on the beach of these animals, but we have a solution. We can take those and move them back to their historic area. So they moved about 500 to 1,000 individuals from that area in the early 1970s before the blast, and they didn't use that term now, started rewilding this area. It's been phenomenally successful. How many of you guys, have you guys seen sea otters or been to, like, a few of you have seen them? I'd almost guarantee they're the descendants of those ones that were flown from Amchitka that were evacuated. 50,000 descendants right now from that one island, and one of every 3 otters in the North Atlantic Ocean. And this is, like the seabird case, really a great one. As one of my colleagues said, ecology isn't rocket science, it's a lot harder. It is true that it's often hard to find these clear patterns bright as day, but Jim Estes was on the island before and after the test, well-known ecologist who put this idea of a trophic cascade, and you see that light up. So this is in the absence of sea otters. You have what's known as urchin barrens, large abundant urchins that eat kelp, that are feeding on any of the macroalgae there. When the sea otters were restored, you have these abundant, large kelp forests returning to that area. And it really has very visible changes to that system. another success story, and not one that was intentionally moved, northern elephant seals. In this picture, there are more elephant seals than there were probably in the world in the 1900s. Now there are as many as probably there ever have been, about 180,000 elephant seals. And that's thanks to a treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and shows you the power of conservation if you do it well. And if the main challenge for these species is that they're being hunted. So we came up with a concept, a concept like the shifting baselines, but the idea of lifting baselines, that these numbers can go up too. And I've been fortunate to work on whales. When I grew up in New York City, I never saw a whale, never saw a seal. They're back there now. I mean, that's the Empire State Building in the back. These are humpback whales there. They're fin whales. That's in part thanks to legislation like the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, but also the Clean Water Act. The waters are much cleaner than they are now, and protecting fisheries. So these patterns can change and will enable us to see more surprises as we have for ecosystems as well as conservation. I don't know if we have time for, with that, I'll thank you guys, and thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Inspiring story of nature recovery.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Actually, we have a few minutes.
Okay.
If anybody wants to direct some questions here, we can take them, and then we can move to the next story. If it's 5 minutes.
It's a hand up, right? Two hands up.
This one. Awesome. Thank you so very much.
Oh, thank you.
Excellent, excellent talk. You mentioned glucocorticoids
Mhm.
and stress hormones being measured in the fecal samples
Yeah.
as well. I wonder if you've done some work with that, or you could tell us about some of the trends your colleagues are finding of those stress hormones changing in whale populations in these anthropogenic
Yeah.
impacted areas.
Excellent question. This is not my work. It's Roz Rolland and my colleagues at New England Aquarium. They've helped collect some samples. They were actually on the water doing this work in 2000 and 2001, measuring these stress levels. So they were in the water September 2001, 9/11 before and after. And it was actually not until like a year later that they realized they could have an incredibly important data set, because at that point, all shipping was shut down for weeks at a time, and they found shifts in level as the noise went down, that there were shifts reduction in the glucocorticoids in that area. Lots of other studies as well. It does seem like they're stressed by these by sound as well as so much activity, but there was just an amazing pattern coming out of that. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about, so obviously this is mostly about whales, if you're noticing kind of these trends in other cetacean communities as well. Like, would you expect dolphins and porpoises and things like that to have similar biological pump?
Yeah. So yes, for sure. And one that we've been starting this project for a long time. So spinner dolphins, for example, feed offshore and then they rest in coral reefs. So they're kind of like, we would assume, like the seabirds, moving these nutrients every day. And it's true for shark. There's several species move offshore and onto shore. So we hypothesize, we still haven't measured that in the field, that spinner dolphins would be doing something like that, and other species of small cetaceans as well, odontocetes. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I was just wondering if there's been any effort to kind of, rather than future forecasting, kind of backcast the impact that human kind of predation or human removal of these whales or other kind of species has had on the overall kind of nutrient cycling, because you're starting to get an idea of what's currently happening but we also know 90% maybe have been lost or something else. Do you have any idea of kind of historically what was going on and how that shifted?
Yeah, so yes, and in any paper we've done, we usually, unless it's just like a very narrow field work, we're also looking at historical populations. And I didn't show the slide, but basically, if we were look that slide where I showed where it's comparable between rivers and whales a little bit, whales go way up in that slide. Atmospheric deposition, which is partly human pollution of nitrogen, goes way down. As well as the coastal points, all the sewage goes away too. So whales would have been a predominant driver in the Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of Maine rather, at that time, once you remove humans out. So yeah, I would say in almost every paper, we're looking at historical populations, to the best of our understanding, contemporary populations, and then sometimes at when they were at their lowest. Yeah, but time, I think those temporal changes are essential.
Just to follow up on that, so you showed the impact of the loss of whale carcasses. Beyond the whales, would surface waters have been ecologically different under this abundance? Have you had any comments on that? That would be different?
Yeah, I think in the places where whales are abundant. So at certain times in certain places, like hotspots, and absolutely. Would surface waters across the world been different? I doubt. My short answer to that is like no, but maybe, we don't have any evidence that, but in areas, it's not unlike the seabirds, and that seabirds, they don't have an impact across ocean systems or island systems, but where they are found, they can make a big difference. That's what we suspect with whales, the same thing, that there would have been. There's one model out suggesting that a lot of that goes to secondary productivity to fish populations, for example. So, sometimes, yeah.
Massive.
Thank you. I want to ask if you missed the dogs, because I'm sure we all do, but I'm
Yes.
curious to know what gives you hope to continue doing your work amid such, I guess, sometimes demoralizing statistics within the context of conservation worldwide.
Yeah, with political changes, it's hard, as one can imagine. Sometimes in the US right now, we're basically going to just be playing defense for several years right now. But these changes, I am lucky, really can occur across our lifetime if we put effort into that. So I probably alternate between despair and hope. Some days it's just with the death of that whale that I showed you, the Gulf, that's a tough one. 30 to 50 out there, and political pressure. They're like political footballs, so the pressure on them is really hard. What gives me hope is I went to a meeting a month ago about that whale, and there were people from the Air Force, the Navy, and National Marine Fisheries Service, all really trying or thinking about how we could improve the management of the species. So there are people around, but if you read the news, it would not, if you just type Gulf of Mexico whale and Matt Gaetz, it's going to be ugly. Yeah. And that was one of Matt Gaetz's, his focuses. If you know who he is, I don't know that you guys may have heard his name, but anyway, very right wing, proposed to be Attorney General in the United States.
Well, if no more obvious questions here, thank you very much. Anybody who wants to have an informal chat over a coffee or soft drinks, and next door, just come join us there. Okay, thank you.